Hi, I'm Emily Thompson from Life So Savory, and today I'm going to show you how to make a paper-pieced quilted throw pillow that looks like this. If you want to make this exact throw pillow, you can download the free pattern from the website, or you can use the technique that I'm going to show you today to make any paper-piece quilted product that you have. We're just going to kind of go over the basics. I love paper-piece quilting because you don't have to fussy cut any pieces of fabric, and you can look like a really professional quilter without actually being a quilter, which is me. I also love that you just need to cut long strips of fabric to begin, and you kind of cut the fabric as you go. This is a perfect project for using fat quarters of fabric because you don't need very much fabric, and you need 3 to 4 to even 5 different colors of fabric to create this design. So let's get started. After you have printed your pattern, you want to trace it onto tissue paper. We're actually going to sew through this paper, thus the paper piecing. And so you want a thin tissue that you're going to be able to sew through and then tear away when you're finished. To begin, you trace the fabric, and not only do you trace the pattern, not only do you trace the lines, but you also need to transfer the numbers because the order we sew is extremely important using this technique. After you have your pattern and design traced, we're actually going to turn it over. So we're looking at the wrong side of the numbers on the tissue paper. And then we're going to find numbers 1 and numbers 2 to begin our quilting. So here's number 1. I cut all my strips of fabric 3 and 4 inches wide because that is wide enough to cover all of these strips on the pattern except for the corners. And those I just cut a little bit bigger when I was mostly finished with the design. So until then, all my 3 to 4 inch strips are going to work just fine. So you take whatever color you want to start with, and we're going to place it face up over the number 1. I want to make sure that between the number 1 and number 2, I have at least a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So you can kind of just check, yep, the number 1 is under there. And then I place my number 2 fabric on top of my number 1 fabric. And I'm going to just put a pin to hold those 2 fabrics together. Now we're going to go over to the machine and sew these. In order to get sharp corners, you do want to make sure that you stitch starting at the very beginning of the line and stop at the very end of the line. I am going to back stitch to make sure that that line stays in place. When you get to the other end, back stitch and then cut your thread. Now we head back over here to the ironing to see what we've got going. This technique does take a bit of space as you need a cutting board and sewing station and an ironing board, but once you get the hang of it, it all goes pretty smoothly. At this point, I'm going to open up my seam and just really quickly press it. That doesn't take very long. Now we flip it back over, and we're wanting to sew the number 3 piece onto our pattern. So to do that, we're trimming as we're going. We're going to take just a piece of cardboard, and I just have the back of a notebook. It's really simple. And you take your cardboard and you place it where number 1, 2, and 3 intersect. So I have 1 and 2 here, 3 being on this side. So I'm going to place my cardboard along that line, and I fold my tissue paper back. Now I see I have all this extra fabric that I really don't want there, and I need to cut a seam allowance. So I'm going to take my clear ruler, place it over the fabric, and hang the ruler over the fabric 1/4 of an inch. Then take your rotary cutter and trim that fabric. Now you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance and trim fabric ready to place number 3. To continue, we flip it back over to the wrong side, we find our number 3, and we decide which fabric we want to use next. You also want to check out, do I need a 4 inch wide or a 3 inch wide piece of fabric to make sure that I'm covering this entire number 3 triangle. So I just line up the pieces. You're going to use the raw edges together, right where you just trimmed, plus the new piece. And I'm going to put a pin in there to keep it together. And then I'm just going to trim this fabric so I don't take this long tail with me over to the sewing machine. And then we pick up our fabric and we head back over to the sewing area. Again, flip your tissue over to the right side so you're looking at the numbers face up. Slide it into your sewing machine and sew on that line where the 1 and 2 intersect with number 3. You try to keep on the lines best you can to make sure that they're straight and that the corners intersect nicely. Again, I like how this makes me look like I have perfect points on my sewing, even though I'm only sewing straight lines. Remove the pin, open it up, and press that seam open. Now we flip it back over to the wrong side and find where number 4 intersects with the seams that we've already sewn. So here I have 1 and 3 intersecting with number 4. So I place my cardboard along that line, open it up. You can see there's all kinds of fabric now to trim. Overhang your clear ruler 1/4 of an inch and trim your fabric. Again, this makes sure that the back of our pillow is not full of all these bulky seams. Okay, number 4 is a pretty thin triangle, and I want to make sure that I'm keeping my design of fabric, so keep rotating which fabrics you're using. You can see that this one we just used a variety of fabrics and kept working in a pattern so that it was pretty random when I was finished. Line up the raw edge where number 4 intersects where we just cut. Take your pin, secure both fabrics to the tissue, and then again, trim that long tail. Once you get the hang of it, this isn't near as difficult as it might originally appear. It's just repetitive, back and forth between your stations, sewing one line at a time, and then opening it up, pressing it, and trimming. Another tip is that sometimes it might be difficult to tear off that paper when you're finished. If you use a shorter stitch length while you're sewing, it does make it a little bit easier to rip that tissue paper off when you're finished. All right, so I'm just trying to keep all my pieces in order here. Press this one open. And then you would continue in the same fashion, going around from 4 to 5, all the way up to 28 when you finished. You can see on this one I've gotten a little bit farther. And check out some of these perfect points. And that is done just by creating these straight lines, ironing, pressing, and continuing to trim. So I love how it looks like I actually knew what I was doing without really knowing what I was doing, just sewing some straight lines. On the back of the pillow, I chose to use additional colors from the fat quarter and just create a simple envelope pillow. So it's quite easy to paper piece once you get the hang of it.